It was supposed to be just another late night at the office. But when the elevator shuddered to a halt between the 12th and 13th floors, I found myself trapped with the one person I never expected to see vulnerable, my boss, Elena Carter. As the minutes turned to hours, the walls of the elevator seemed to close in, and so did the distance between us. What started as an awkward silence soon unraveled into a confession that would change everything: her secrets, her desires, and the undeniable pull between us. The office was quiet, too quiet. The kind of quiet that made the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead feel like a distant buzz in the back of my skull. I sat at my desk, staring at the spreadsheet on my screen, the numbers blurring together as my eyes strained against the late hour. It was well past 8 p.m., and the rest of the floor had emptied out hours ago. Even the cleaning staff had come and gone, leaving behind the faint scent of lemon-scented disinfectant. I sighed, leaning back in my chair and running a hand through my hair. Another late night. Another evening spent trying to prove myself in a job that felt like it was eating me alive. I glanced at the clock in the corner of my screen. 8:23 p.m. If I left now, I could still catch the last train home. But the report wasn't going to finish itself, and I wasn't about to give Elena Carter another reason to doubt my commitment. Elena. Just the thought of her made my stomach twist. She was everything I wasn't: confident, poised, effortlessly brilliant. The kind of woman who could walk into a room and command attention without saying a word. And she was my boss. My very intimidating, very unapproachable boss. I shook my head, trying to push the thought of her out of my mind. Focus, Claire. Focus. I turned back to my screen, forcing myself to dive back into the numbers. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling of exhaustion creeping over me. My eyes were heavy, my shoulders tense, and my mind kept wandering to the stack of unpaid bills waiting for me at home and the voicemails from my mom I still hadn't returned. Finally, I gave up. The report could wait until tomorrow. I saved my work, shut down my computer, and grabbed my bag, slinging it over my shoulder as I stood. The office felt eerie in the dim light, the rows of empty desks casting long shadows across the floor. I made my way to the elevator, my footsteps echoing in the silence. The elevator doors slid open with a soft ding, and I stepped inside, pressing the button for the lobby. As the doors began to close, a voice called out, sharp and commanding, "Hold the elevator." I reacted on instinct, my hand shooting out to stop the doors. They jerked open again, and there she was, Elena Carter. Her heels clicked against the marble floor as she strode toward me, her tailored blazer hugging her frame perfectly, her dark hair swept back in its usual flawless bun. She looked as put together as ever, like she hadn't just spent the last 12 hours at the office. "Thanks," she said briskly, stepping into the elevator beside me. Her perfume was subtle but intoxicating, something expensive and floral that made my head spin. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak, and pressed the button again. The doors closed, and the elevator began its descent. I stared straight ahead, acutely aware of her presence beside me. The silence was suffocating, the kind of silence that made you hyper-aware of every breath, every movement. I could feel her eyes on me, and I fought the urge to fidget under her gaze. "Long day?" she asked finally, her voice cutting through the quiet. I glanced at her, surprised. She wasn't looking at me, her gaze fixed on the numbers above the door as they ticked down. "Yeah," I said, my voice sounding too loud in the small space. "Just trying to get caught up on some reports." She nodded, her expression unreadable. "I appreciate the dedication. Not everyone is willing to put in the extra hours." I wasn't sure if that was a compliment or a veiled criticism, so I stayed quiet. The elevator continued its descent, the numbers ticking down painfully slowly. 12, 11, 10, and then it happened. The elevator jerked violently, the lights flickering as the car came to an abrupt halt. I stumbled, grabbing the railing to steady myself, my heart pounding in my chest. Elena reached out instinctively, her hand brushing against my arm as she steadied herself against the wall. "What the hell?" she muttered, pressing the button for the lobby again. Nothing happened. The elevator was completely still, the lights dim and flickering. I felt a surge of panic rising in my chest. Is it stuck? Elena didn't answer right away. She pressed the emergency button, holding it down for a few seconds before releasing it. No response. She pulled out her phone, her brow furrowing as she checked the screen. No signal, she said, her voice tight. I pulled out my own phone, my hands trembling slightly. No signal. Of course. We were trapped. The reality of the situation hit me like a punch to the gut. Trapped in an elevator. With Elena Carter. Of all the people I could have been stuck with, it had to be her. I glanced at her, trying to gauge her reaction. She looked calm, too calm, her expression unreadable as she slipped her phone back into her pocket. Well, she said after a moment, her tone dry. This is inconvenient. Inconvenient. That was one way to put it. I leaned back against the wall, trying to steady my breathing. The air felt heavier now, the walls closing in around us. I could feel the weight of her presence beside me, the tension in the air thick enough to cut with a knife. And then, in the dim light of the stalled elevator, she turned to me, her eyes meeting mine for the first time. There was something in her gaze, something I couldn't quite place. A flicker of vulnerability, maybe, or something else entirely. Claire, she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. There's something I need to tell you. The sound of her voice saying my name sent a shiver down my spine. It wasn't the sharp, professional tone I was used to hearing from her. This was softer, almost hesitant. I turned to face her fully, my back pressed against the cool metal wall of the elevator. The flickering light cast shadows across her face, making her expression harder to read. What is it? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. My heart was pounding so loudly I was sure she could hear it. Elena hesitated, her lips parting as if she were about to speak, then closing again. She looked away, her gaze dropping to the floor. For a moment, the only sound was the faint hum of the emergency lights above us. Then she took a deep breath, as if steeling herself, and met my eyes again. I've been struggling, she said finally, her voice trembling slightly. With things. Personal things. I blinked, caught off guard. Elena Carter? Struggling? The woman who always seemed so in control, so untouchable? I couldn't imagine her admitting to anything less than perfection. And yet, here she was, standing in front of me, her guard down in a way I'd never seen before. What kind of things? I asked carefully, not wanting to push her too far. She shook her head, a bitter laugh escaping her lips. It's stupid, really. I shouldn't even be telling you this. But being stuck here, with no way out, it's like the walls are closing in, and I can't keep it all bottled up anymore. I didn't know what to say. My mind was racing, trying to process what was happening. This wasn't the Elena I knew. The Elena I knew was composed, confident, always in control. This version of her was raw, vulnerable, and it was throwing me off balance. You can tell me, I said finally, my voice soft. Whatever it is, I won't judge. She looked at me for a long moment, her eyes searching mine as if trying to decide whether or not to trust me. Then she sighed, running a hand through her hair, a rare gesture of frustration that I'd never seen from her before. I've been lonely, she admitted, her voice barely audible. I've spent so much of my life focused on my career, on proving myself, that I've let everything else fall by the wayside. My relationships, my personal life, it's all a mess. And I don't know how to fix it. Her words hung in the air between us, heavy with unspoken emotion. I felt a pang of sympathy for her, mixed with something else I couldn't quite name. It was strange, seeing her like this. It made her feel more human, more real. I get that, I said quietly. I mean, not the career part, obviously, but the loneliness. I know what that feels like. She looked at me, her eyes softening. Do you? I nodded, my throat tightening. Yeah. It's like, no matter how many people are around you, you still feel alone. Like you're just going through the motions, waiting for something to change. She didn't say anything for a moment, just studied me with an intensity that made my skin prickle. Then she took a step closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. What if I told you I didn't want to feel that way anymore? I swallowed hard, my pulse quickening. What do you mean? She hesitated, her gaze flickering to my lips for the briefest of moments before meeting my eyes again. I mean, what if I told you I've been feeling something for you? Something I shouldn't feel, but I can't help it. My breath caught in my throat. This couldn't be real. This had to be some kind of dream, or maybe a hallucination brought on by the stress of being trapped in an elevator. But the look in her eyes, the raw, unfiltered emotion, told me this was real. Too real. Elena, I started, but she cut me off, her voice trembling with urgency. I know it's wrong. I know it's inappropriate. But I can't keep pretending like I don't feel this way. Every time I see you, every time we're in the same room, it's like I can't breathe, and I don't know what to do about it. I stared at her, my mind spinning. This was Elena Carter, my boss, the woman I'd admired from afar, the woman who'd always seemed so out of reach. And now she was standing here, telling me she felt something for me. Something real. I don't know what to say, I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. She took another step closer, her hand reaching out to brush against mine. The touch was electric, sending a jolt of warmth through me. You don't have to say anything, she said softly. Just tell me if I'm crazy. Tell me if I'm reading this all wrong. I looked into her eyes, searching for any sign of doubt, any hint that this was some kind of mistake. But all I saw was honesty, vulnerability, and something else, something that made my heart ache in the best possible way. You're not crazy, I said finally, my voice trembling. I feel it too. Her breath hitched, and for a moment, neither of us moved. The air between us was charged, heavy with unspoken desire. And then, slowly, she leaned in, her lips brushing against mine in a kiss that was tentative at first, but quickly deepened into something more. It was like nothing I'd ever experienced before. Her lips were soft, her touch gentle but insistent, and I felt myself melting into her, my hands reaching up to tangle in her hair. The world outside the elevator ceased to exist, and all that mattered was the way she felt against me, the way her breath mingled with mine. When we finally pulled apart, both of us were breathless, our foreheads resting against each other as we tried to steady our racing hearts. I could feel her trembling, her hands still gripping my arms as if she were afraid I might disappear. What happens now? I asked, my voice barely audible. She didn't answer right away, just looked at me with a mixture of fear and hope in her eyes. I don't know, she admitted. But whatever it is, we'll figure it out together. The silence that followed was heavy, filled with the weight of what had just happened. My mind was a whirlwind of emotions, shock, confusion, and a strange, giddy excitement that I couldn't quite suppress. Elena's hands were still on my arms, her touch warm and grounding, but her expression was unreadable. She looked like she was trying to piece together what had just happened, just as I was. I opened my mouth to say something, anything, but no words came out. What could I even say? That kiss had changed everything, and yet it felt like the most natural thing in the world. Like it was something we'd both been waiting for without even realizing it. Elena was the first to break the silence. She took a step back, her hands dropping to her sides, and let out a shaky breath. I shouldn't have done that, she said, her voice low and tinged with regret. I'm your boss. This is inappropriate. Her words hit me like a bucket of cold water, dousing the warmth that had been building inside me. I stared at her, my heart sinking. Do you regret it? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She hesitated, her eyes searching mine. I don't know, she admitted. I don't want to make things complicated for you. For us. I shook my head, taking a step closer to her. It's already complicated, Elena. And I don't care. That kiss, it meant something. Didn't it? She looked away, her jaw tightening. Of course it did. But that doesn't mean it was the right thing to do. I reached out, gently touching her arm. Maybe it wasn't the right thing. But it felt right. At least to me. She turned back to me, her eyes filled with a mixture of longing and uncertainty. Claire, I don't know how to do this. I don't know how to balance what I feel with what's expected of me. I've spent my entire life following the rules, doing what I'm supposed to do. And this isn't part of the plan. I could hear the conflict in her voice, the struggle between what she wanted and what she thought she should want. It was a feeling I knew all too well. Maybe it's time to stop following the plan, I said softly. Maybe it's time to do something for yourself for once. She looked at me, her eyes softening. And what if it all falls apart? What if I lose everything I've worked for? What if you don't? I countered. What if this is the thing that makes everything else worth it? She didn't answer right away, just stared at me as if she were trying to memorize my face. Then, slowly, she reached out and cupped my cheek, her thumb brushing against my skin. "You're brave, Claire," she said quietly. "Braver than I am." I leaned into her touch, my heart aching at the vulnerability in her voice. "You're braver than you think," I replied. "You just have to let yourself be." For a moment, neither of us spoke. The elevator felt smaller than ever, the air thick with unspoken words and unresolved tension. And then, just as I thought she might pull away again, she leaned in and kissed me. This time, it was slower, more deliberate, as if she were trying to convey everything she couldn't say out loud. I kissed her back, my hands finding their way to her waist, pulling her closer. It was different from the first kiss, less frantic, more tender. It felt like a promise, like the start of something neither of us could fully understand yet. When we finally broke apart, she rested her forehead against mine, her breath warm against my skin. "We're going to have to figure this out," she murmured. "Once we get out of here, I mean." I nodded, my heart pounding. "I know. But we will. Together." She smiled faintly, a hint of the confidence I was used to seeing in her returning to her expression. "Together," she echoed. The sound of the elevator creaking brought us back to reality. We both froze, listening as the machinery groaned and shuddered. Then, with a sudden jolt, the elevator began to move again, the lights flickering back to life. Elena stepped back, smoothing her blazer and running a hand through her hair. I could see the mask slipping back into place, the vulnerability she'd shown me moments ago being tucked away. But her eyes still held a softness when she looked at me, a reminder of what had just passed between us. The elevator doors slid open, revealing the empty lobby. We stepped out, the cool air hitting us like a wake-up call. Elena glanced at me, her expression unreadable. "We should talk about this later," she said quietly. "When we're not at work." I nodded, my stomach twisting with a mix of anticipation and anxiety. "Yeah, later." She gave me one last look, her gaze lingering for a moment longer than necessary, before turning and walking toward the exit. I watched her go, my mind still reeling from everything that had happened. As I made my way out of the building, the night air crisp against my skin, I couldn't help but feel like my life had just shifted in a way I couldn't fully comprehend. Whatever was happening between Elena and me, it was far from simple. But for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. The next morning, I woke up with a knot in my stomach and Elena's words echoing in my mind. "We should talk about this later." Later. What did that even mean? Later today? Later this week? Later, never? I groaned, rolling over and burying my face in my pillow. The rational part of my brain knew we needed to talk, to figure out what the kiss meant and where we went from here. But the other part of me, the part that had spent the entire night replaying the moment in the elevator, was terrified of what that conversation might bring. I dragged myself out of bed, my body heavy with exhaustion. I hadn't slept much, my mind too busy racing through 1,000 different scenarios. What if she regretted it? What if she decided it was a mistake? What if she didn't feel the same way I did? The questions swirled in my head, each one more anxiety-inducing than the last. By the time I got to the office, I was a nervous wreck. I tried to focus on my work, but every time I heard footsteps in the hallway, my heart skipped a beat. What would I even say to her? How would I act? Would things be awkward now? Would she avoid me? The uncertainty was killing me. It wasn't until mid-morning that I saw her. She walked past my desk, her heels clicking against the floor, her expression as composed and unreadable as ever. She didn't look at me, didn't even glance in my direction. My stomach sank. Was this her way of telling me it was a mistake? That she wanted to pretend it never happened? I tried to push the thought out of my mind, focusing on the spreadsheet in front of me. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't concentrate. My eyes kept drifting to her office, the door slightly ajar, as if taunting me. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my coffee mug and headed to the break room, hoping a change of scenery would help clear my head. The break room was empty, the hum of the coffee machine the only sound. I poured myself a cup, my hands trembling slightly as I added cream and sugar. I was so lost in my thoughts that I didn't hear her come in. Claire. Her voice startled me, and I nearly dropped my mug. I turned to see Elena standing in the doorway, her arms crossed, her expression unreadable. My heart leapt into my throat. "Elena," I said, my voice shaky. "Hi." She stepped inside, closing the door behind her. The sound of it clicking shut made my stomach twist. "We need to talk," she said, her tone firm but not unkind. I nodded, clutching my mug like a lifeline. "Yeah, I know." She took a step closer, her eyes searching mine. "Last night, it shouldn't have happened. I shouldn't have let it happen." Her words felt like a punch to the gut. I looked down at my coffee, the steam rising in faint wisps. "Do you regret it?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She didn't answer right away, and the silence stretched between us, heavy and suffocating. Finally, she sighed, running a hand through her hair. "I don't know," she admitted. "I don't regret the kiss itself. But I regret the timing. The circumstances. I'm your boss, Claire. It's complicated." I looked up at her, my heart aching at the conflict in her eyes. "I know it's complicated," I said softly. "But that doesn't mean it's wrong." She shook her head, her expression pained. "You don't understand. If anyone finds out, it could ruin both of our careers. And I can't let that happen. Not to you." Her words hit me harder than I expected. She wasn't just worried about herself, she was worried about me. About what this could mean for me. I set my mug down on the counter, my hands trembling. "Elena, I'm not a child. I know the risks. And I'm willing to take them. If this is something you want, then I want it too." She stared at me, her eyes filled with a mixture of longing and fear. "You don't know what you're saying," she said quietly. "This isn't just about us. It's about the consequences. The fallout. I can't ask you to risk everything for me." "You're not asking," I said, my voice steady despite the storm of emotions inside me. "I'm choosing. And I choose you." For a moment, she just looked at me, her expression unreadable. Then, slowly, she stepped closer, her hand reaching out to brush against mine. "You're incredible, you know that," she said softly. "Brave and kind and everything I'm not." I shook my head, my heart swelling at her words. "That's not true. You're strong and brilliant and I see you, Elena. The real you. Not just the boss, not just the persona you show everyone else. And I care about you. More than I probably should." Her breath hitched, and for a moment, I thought she might pull away. But then she leaned in, her forehead resting against mine. "This is going to be messy," she whispered. "And hard. And there's no guarantee it will work out." "I know," I said, my voice trembling. "But I'd rather try and fail than never try at all." She didn't say anything for a long moment, just stood there with her eyes closed, her breath warm against my skin. Then, finally, she nodded. "Okay," she said softly. "Okay." The word felt like a promise, a fragile but hopeful beginning. I reached up, brushing a strand of hair away from her face, my heart pounding as she leaned into my touch. For the first time in what felt like forever, I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. The days that followed were a strange mix of tension and quiet moments of connection. Elena and I didn't talk about what had happened in the break room, not directly. But there was a shift between us, an unspoken understanding that something had changed. We were careful, of course too careful, maybe. But every glance, every brush of hands, every lingering moment felt charged with the weight of what we weren't saying. Work became a balancing act. I tried to focus on my tasks, to keep my head down and act like everything was normal. But it was impossible not to notice her. She was everywhere, walking past my desk, standing in the hallway, sitting in meetings with that same composed expression that gave nothing away. And every time our eyes met, even for a second, my heart would skip a beat. IT was during one of those meetings that things came to a head. We were in the conference room, the entire team gathered around the table as Elena led the discussion. I was trying to pay attention, really I was, but my mind kept wandering. I couldn't stop thinking about the way she'd looked at me in the break room, the way her voice had softened when she said my name, Claire. Her voice snapped me out of my thoughts, and I looked up to see the entire team staring at me. My face flushed as I realized I'd missed something important. "I'm sorry," I said quickly. "Could you repeat that?" Elena's expression was unreadable, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes, amusement, maybe, or something softer. "The quarterly report," she said, her tone professional but not unkind. "I was asking for your input on the marketing strategy." I nodded, scrambling to gather my thoughts. "Right. I think we should focus on social media engagement. It's been a growing channel for us, and if we allocate more resources there, we could see a significant ROI." She nodded, her gaze lingering on me for a moment longer than necessary before she turned back to the team. "Good point. Let's explore that further." The meeting continued, but I could barely focus. My heart was still racing, my mind replaying the way she'd looked at me. It was stupid, really, how much that small moment had affected me. But it was also a reminder of how precarious this thing between us was. We were walking a tightrope, and one wrong move could send us both tumbling. After the meeting, I lingered at my desk, pretending to be engrossed in my work as the rest of the team filed out. Elena was the last to leave, her heels clicking against the floor as she walked past me. She didn't say anything, but as she passed, her hand brushed against my shoulder, a fleeting touch that sent a shiver down my spine. I waited a few minutes before following her, my heart pounding as I made my way to her office. The door was slightly ajar, and I knocked softly before pushing it open. She was sitting at her desk, her eyes focused on her computer screen, but she looked up as I entered. "Claire," she said, her voice calm but with an undercurrent of something I couldn't quite place. "What can I do for you?" I closed the door behind me, my hands trembling slightly. I wanted to talk. About us." She leaned back in her chair, her expression unreadable. "What about us?" I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves. "I know this is complicated. And I know we have to be careful. But I can't keep pretending like nothing's changed. I need to know where we stand." She didn't answer right away, just studied me with that same intense gaze that always made me feel like she could see straight through me. Finally, she sighed, running a hand through her hair. "Claire, I don't have all the answers. This is new for me too. But what I do know is that I care about you. More than I should, maybe. And I want to see where this goes. But we have to be smart about it." I nodded, my heart swelling at her words. "I know. And I'm willing to do whatever it takes. I need to know that you're in this too." She stood, walking around her desk until she was standing in front of me. Her hand reached out, brushing against my cheek in a gesture that was so tender it made my chest ache. "I'm in," she said softly. "But we have to be careful. No one can know. Not yet." I leaned into her touch, my eyes closing for a moment as I savored the feeling of her hand against my skin. "I understand," I whispered. "I'll be careful. I promise." She nodded, her thumb brushing against my cheekbone. "Good. Because I don't want to lose you, Claire. Not before we've even had a chance to see what this could be." Her words sent a warmth spreading through me, a sense of hope that I hadn't realized I'd been missing. For the first time in what felt like forever, I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. The next few weeks passed in a blur of stolen moments and quiet glances. Elena and I were careful, always mindful of the line we were walking. We didn't meet outside of work, didn't text or call unless it was strictly professional. But in the office, in those brief moments when no one was looking, we found ways to connect. A brush of hands as she passed me a file. A lingering look across the conference room. A whispered word in the break room when no one else was around. IT was thrilling and terrifying all at once. Every touch, Every glance felt like a secret we were keeping from the world. And as much as I tried to focus on my work, my mind kept drifting back to her, to the way her eyes softened when she looked at me, to the way her voice sounded when she said my name. But as the days turned into weeks, the tension between us grew. It was like a slow burn, simmering just beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to ignite. And then, one evening, it finally did. I was working late again, the office quiet and empty except for the faint hum of the fluorescent lights. I was so engrossed in my work that I didn't hear her come in. It wasn't until she was standing right beside my desk that I realized she was there. "Claire," she said softly, her voice breaking the silence. I looked up, my heart skipping a beat at the sight of her. She was wearing a dark blazer and a pencil skirt, her hair loose around her shoulders instead of its usual sleek bun. She looked softer, somehow. More approachable. "Elena," I said, my voice trembling slightly. "What are you still doing here?" She didn't answer right away, just leaned against the edge of my desk, her arms crossed. "I could ask you the same thing." I shrugged, trying to ignore the way my pulse was racing. "Just trying to get caught up on some reports. You know how it is." She nodded, her gaze drifting to the papers scattered across my desk. "You work too hard, you know that?" I laughed, a nervous, breathless sound. "Says the woman who's always the last to leave." She smiled faintly, her eyes meeting mine. "Touché." For a moment, neither of us spoke. The air between us was thick with unspoken words, with the weight of everything we weren't saying. And then, slowly, she reached out, her fingers brushing against mine. "Claire," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I can't keep doing this." My heart sank at her words, a cold dread settling in my chest. "What do you mean?" She shook her head, her eyes filled with a mixture of longing and regret. This pretending, this hiding, it's killing me. I want to be with you. Really be with you. But I don't know how to do that without risking everything." I stared at her, my mind racing. Was she saying what I thought she was saying? That she wanted more? That she was ready to take the next step? "Elena," I said, my voice trembling. "If you're saying what I think you're saying, then I'm in. All in. But we have to be smart about it. We can't just throw caution to the wind." She nodded, her hand tightening around mine. "I know. And I don't want to rush into anything. But I also don't want to keep pretending like this isn't real. Like you're not everything." Her words sent a warmth spreading through me, a sense of hope that I hadn't realized I'd been missing. I stood, my hands still in hers, and took a step closer. "You're everything to me too," I whispered. "And I don't want to hide anymore. But we have to be careful. We have to figure this out together." She nodded, her eyes searching mine. "Together," she echoed. And then, before I could say anything else, she leaned in and kissed me. It was different from the kisses we'd shared before, softer, slower, more deliberate. It felt like a promise, like the start of something neither of us could fully understand yet. When we finally pulled apart, both of us were breathless, our foreheads resting against each other as we tried to steady our racing hearts. I could feel her trembling, her hands still gripping mine as if she were afraid I might disappear. "What happens now?" I asked, my voice barely audible. She didn't answer right away, just looked at me with a mixture of fear and hope in her eyes. "I don't know," she admitted. "But whatever it is, we'll figure it out together." The days after our conversation in the break room were a whirlwind of emotions. Elena and I were careful, always mindful of the line we were walking. We didn't meet outside of work, didn't text or call unless it was strictly professional. But in the office, in those brief moments when no one was looking, we found ways to connect. A brush of hands as she passed me a file. A lingering look across the conference room. A whispered word in the break room when no one else was around. IT was thrilling and terrifying all at once. Every touch, every glance felt like a secret we were keeping from the world. And as much as I tried to focus on my work, my mind kept drifting back to her, to the way her eyes softened when she looked at me, to the way her voice sounded when she said my name. But as the days turned into weeks, the tension between us grew. It was like a slow burn, simmering just beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to ignite. And then, One evening, it finally did. I was working late again, the office quiet and empty except for the faint hum of the fluorescent lights. I was so engrossed in my work that I didn't hear her come in. It wasn't until she was standing right beside my desk that I realized she was there. "Claire," she said softly, her voice breaking the silence. I looked up, my heart skipping a beat at the sight of her. She was wearing a dark blazer and a pencil skirt, her hair loose around her shoulders instead of its usual sleek bun. She looked softer, somehow. More approachable. "Elena," I said, my voice trembling slightly. "What are you still doing here?" She didn't answer right away, just leaned against the edge of my desk, her arms crossed. "I could ask you the same thing." I shrugged, trying to ignore the way my pulse was racing. "Just trying to get caught up on some reports. You know how it is." She nodded, her gaze drifting to the papers scattered across my desk. "You work too hard, you know that?" I laughed, a nervous, breathless sound. Says the woman who's always the last to leave. She smiled faintly, her eyes meeting mine. Touché. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The air between us was thick with unspoken words, with the weight of everything we weren't saying. And then, slowly, she reached out, her fingers brushing against mine. "Claire," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I can't keep doing this." My heart sank at her words, a cold dread settling in my chest. "What do you mean?" She shook her head, her eyes filled with a mixture of longing and regret. This pretending, this hiding, it's killing me. I want to be with you. Really be with you. But I don't know how to do that without risking everything." I stared at her, my mind racing. Was she saying what I thought she was saying? That she wanted more? That she was ready to take the next step? "Elena," I said, my voice trembling. "If you're saying what I think you're saying, then I'm in. All in. But we have to be smart about it. We can't just throw caution to the wind." She nodded, her hand tightening around mine. "I know. And I don't want to rush into anything. But I also don't want to keep pretending like this isn't real. Like you're not everything." Her words sent a warmth spreading through me, a sense of hope that I hadn't realized I'd been missing. I stood, my hands still in hers, and took a step closer. "You're everything to me too," I whispered. "And I don't want to hide anymore. But we have to be careful. We have to figure this out together." She nodded, her eyes searching mine. "Together," she echoed.